Welcome back to the No Morning Show here on TTT. I am Natalie Legore, and in our spotlight this morning, lawyer, head of the business chamber in Tobago, Martin George, to talk to us. Right now, it's about the delayed implementation of the public sector safe zone. Good morning to you, Mr. George.
Yeah, hi, good morning to you, Natalie, and good morning to all your viewers on TTT.
Surprised by the delay that was announced by the Prime Minister on Saturday?
Not at all, Natalie. I think this is a reflection of the government's slow climb down from the position after hoisting itself on its own petard. Because you made the announcement mid-December, with great fanfare that this is going to be the position, and you gave a specific date for implementation, and it appears that clearly you were not ready. So now you find yourself impaled on the horns of a dilemma, because here you have, on the one hand, you've given a specific date and you had said there was going to be implementation by that date. And then now you got tremendous pushback, which, quite frankly, I don't think they ought to have been surprised at. They ought to have expected that, So when they get the pushback, then they say, well, the legislation is not ready, the consultations are not completed. And, it is just, I think a situation where the government ends up with a tremendous amount of egg on its face, because there's no way you can actually pull this back, This is basically the horse having bolted, and you're now seeking to close the barn door. Because once you have this type of retreat and this scaling back, I guarantee you, Natalie, it's going to be the hardest thing in the long run to eventually be able to enforce this. Because what happens is those who are opposed to it become emboldened. Because it's like war. You have to remember, when you read all the books about tactics, you read of, how Machiavelli and, how Napoleon and how these guys, how they, think, you realize that, look, once you start to retreat like this, then it's seen as a sign of weakness. It's seen as a sign of unreadiness, unpreparedness, and your opposition, your opposers, they become emboldened. So the unions are not going to back down now. Those public servants who were opposed to it, they're not going to back down now. They will feel, well, hey, look, we've started to have the government on the run, and they're just going to keep up the pressure. You saw yesterday there was a massive march in the savannah.
The reality is that if the government brings that piece of legislation, will it really make a difference what the people think or want?
Well, the fact of the matter is that if you notice, what they're looking for is not just to bring the legislation and impose it by force. They want to get that buy-in. And that has been the challenge, because they could have brought mandatory vaccination legislation across the board. Months ago, in fact, more than a year ago, they could have done that. So there's nothing preventing you from doing that. We already have mandatory vaccination laws on our books for primary school children under the public health regulations, which govern the admission to primary schools, where you must be vaccinated. All of us went through that. We've all been subject to mandatory vaccinations in order to get entry into public primary schools. So there's no challenge in terms of the legislation at all. You can, but I think what the government wants is to get some kind of buy-in. And that's where the challenge has been. And, the fact of the matter is, if you knew you didn't have that, then it just looks a little bit weak if it is that you now are doing the slow climb down, because what you may see after this next month, you may see another extension until it becomes like a standing joke, and then they may have to abandon the idea eventually, because then they will say, well, we've gotten enough public servants vaccinated. So, right. that appears to be the approach.
Yeah, but if the end goal is to get people vaccinated, isn't the government on the right track then, where it's getting people to get vaccinated and doesn't have to impose this idea of mandatory vaccines?
Well, then in that case, then what you ought to have done is not give a definite deadline or timeline such as this, because then you appear to be playing games with serious issues. If you knew that that was your intention, that you were never going to implement the legislation, then don't come out publicly and make those kinds of announcements. That's not good governance. That's not good leadership. That's not good guidance, if you understand me. All right. So you therefore have to say, well, look, hey, we may have to consider it, or we might be considering it, or something of the sort. But when you come and you give a definite date and you say by such and such a date, then the minute you start to climb down, it begins to appear as a sign of retreat and a sign
Or
of weakness
Or
in your plan.
the flip side to that is that it worked because since the announcement and yesterday, they have seen an uptake in vaccines in the public sector.
Well, it couldn't be that it worked, because then in that case, then the government would have announced that they're not bothering with it because they've gotten sufficient people vaccinated. So it has not worked. But I guess the idea is you give another deadline and hope that that either induces or coerces more people to get vaccinated until I guess they could eventually announce, well, it has worked, as you're saying. We've gotten
Yeah.
enough people vaccinated.
Well, I'm not sure how that is going to work because we saw yesterday the protest at the Queen's Park, Savannah, which is suggesting that even after the announcement, people are displeased. At least some people in society are displeased.
Well, the fact is, you'll always have protesters and you'll have anti-vaxxers. I'll give you an example, Natalie. As far back as in 1853, in the UK, they had to implement mandatory smallpox vaccination laws because there were anti-vaccination leagues, persons who were protesting against vaccination. And I'm talking about, this is more than a century and a half ago we're talking about, So that has always been part and parcel of the makeup of humanity. People always are fearful and distrustful of what they don't know, what they don't understand, but it doesn't seem to apply to KFC. We seem to love it, notwithstanding the fact that we don't know what the 11 herbs and spices are. We love Angostura, even though we don't know what are the ingredients that make up bitters. But that aside, the fact of the matter is that you've always had this type of thing in society. So it's not unsurprising. Look at what happened in Amsterdam last weekend. There were massive protests. It's just that the police handled it a bit differently across there than how we saw occurred in Trinidad and Tobago. But you will always get that kind of thing. Look at what happens in Paris. You've had weekends of mass protests in Paris, over vaccination mandates, against Macron and his policies. So that's to be expected. That I wouldn't worry about in terms of thinking that that should deter any government from their policies, because you will always get that. The fact of the matter is, I think there ought to be some clear, concise, concrete steps towards a goal. And the hesitancy, has now translated from vaccination hesitancy to governmental hesitancy. And that is what I'm concerned about, because that's not good for the economy. It's not good for the leadership and direction of the country. Even, you look at it from a holistic perspective, as a leader, it does not look good in that sense.
Well, let's talk about the THA. Do you believe that as well is government hesitancy? Because we're hearing from the THA that he can't just go carte blanche with this idea of public sector vaccines because of how the THA is set up and how many people might be affected. Do you believe that, I know you've always supported vaccination, but do you believe that the THA is different, or it should adapt the policy of the government of safe zone, public sector safe zones?
All right, okay. So, Natalie, I always love to have recourse to the law and to history, all right? So I will cite three things for you. Number one, under the law, it has already been determined and deemed that persons who work for the THA in the civil service sector are deemed to be public servants. That is law. So there's no question of, public servants generally, and then THA, public servants or THA civil servants. No. They are public servants of Trinidad and Tobago. That is in the law. So if the government makes a law or a decree or a determination for public servants, then it applies across the board, not just to public servants in Trinidad, but it also applies to Tobago. Secondly, there's the judgment of the Honorable Justice Nadia Kangaloo in the matter of THA versus Attorney General, where she declared and she made it pellucid that once the cabinet, as the guiding body of the parliament, of the government in Trinidad and Tobago, once the cabinet makes a decision on a policy, then that policy cannot be varied or altered by the THA. There is a judgment on record in that regard. So in other words, what she said is, notwithstanding the idea of autonomy of Tobago and, the fact that, the THA wants to exercise its own independence, if there is a government policy by the cabinet on the issue, then the THA is bound to follow that policy. I was in that case. I was part of
Mr.
that
George,
trial. So it's a fact. That's the ruling of the court.
Mr. George, let me interrupt you and read something from today's Newsday. And this is Mr. Augustine responding to the Attorney General sometime last week, saying that, if a law is passed, the law is for all of Trinidad and Tobago. But according to the Newsday, quoting Mr. Augustine, it says, "I would caution you not to listen much to the AG. He is known for not winning many cases in the court, and he's known for not being a very brilliant lawyer either. I wouldn't pay him much attention. The THA pays a cadre of public servants and staff, and we decide whether we pay them or not. That doesn't come from Trinidad. That is devolved authority of the THA, and I have a responsibility to make a decision that is a responsible one."
Well, the thing is, I think what you are seeing, Natalie, is that Mr. Augustine, as Chief Secretary, he is growing into and assuming the persona of the Tobago strongman, and his supporters love him for it. So I think you will see more and more of this type of pushback from him, because he recognizes that this, it cements his power base and his strength among his supporters in Tobago, because they love the idea of, a leader who can thumb your nose at Trinidad and tell Trinidad where to get off. So I think that's the role that Mr. Augustine is playing there. But we must remember, from a factual perspective, and this was the third point that I was going to make, so it's a nice segue into it actually. The third point I was going to make was, from a financial perspective, at the end of the day, while the THA does in fact directly pay the public servants who work in the THA, the money comes from Trinidad. So let's be realistic. At the end of the day, every year you get your allocations from Trinidad. You get $3 or $4 billion, depending on how much ever, and that's what you use to deal with all these recurrent expenditures. And in fact, remember, Natalie, the last budget, THA, their recurrent expenditures were 88.1% of the budget. I did the calculations. 88.1% of the budget was spent on recurrent expenditure. So even though, so it's almost like, Natalie, you own a farm, and you give your supervisor the money every Friday to pay the workers. And the supervisor is telling the workers, well, I am the one paying you, so I am the one in charge of you. At the end of the day, where's the money coming from? Let's be realistic, But I mean, as I say, Mr. Augustine is playing to his audience, and it works well for him. So I guess you would see more of that, because his audience loves that, and I mean, they lap it up. But I mean, from a practical, financial, and legislative perspective, it does appear that it may not be a factually sustainable position.
Right. So I know we're supposed to hear from Mr. Augustine today as in what the THA's perspective is. Let us just play devil's advocate and say he decides not to go ahead with the mandatory vaccination for Tobago, really taking into consideration that the THA is different. When you employ 60% of people on the island, and when, if you're to furlough 50%, it really means that you're going to be putting the staff and putting the services in Tobago at a disadvantage, considering that already it's at a disadvantage. How do you think that would work, though, with central government if this decision is taken by the THA?
Well, I mean, there are two things there, Natalie. First of all, you have the practical considerations, because nobody wants to see workers not receive their salaries and people out of a job, or no one wants to see you go into offices of the THA and most of the staff are absent because of this vaccination policy. So no one really wants to see that. That's from a practical consideration standpoint. However, the legal and legislative standpoint is that if there is central government policy on any issue coming from the cabinet. I mean, and I tell you, Natalie, in that case, we went through everything. We went through the establishment of the original THA under the 1980 Act. We went through the second iteration of the THA under the 1996 Act. We checked Hansard, we checked the records, we looked at all the speeches, the debates. Everything was canvassed in that case. And I recommend that judgment of Justice Nadia Kangaloo as essential reading, maybe for all THA members and representatives, so that they will understand that notwithstanding the persona one may want to effect and the image one may want to project as, you know, a Tobago strongman, the fact of the matter is there's law and there's legislation which both govern the scenario. And until the law is changed, until the legislation is changed, until the case is determined otherwise or overturned, that remains what has to guide us, because we are a society that is founded on law and order. And we are to observe the rule of law.
You do believe that the government erred in how it decided to handle the situation with the announcement and then doing the consultations after. What do you think could possibly...
I mean, it clearly was backwards thinking, you know, to do that and then decide, well, you want to have the consultations after, and then when you get the pushback from the unions, you're saying, well, you want to meet with them, you want to hear from them. I mean, you must have known that they would have opposed it. So, you know, I mean, if you want the buy-in, so it's either, you see, you can't have it both ways, Natalie. It's either you saying, look, I am passing this law regardless and let the chips fall where they may. And I don't care. I don't want to hear anything. You know, like former Prime Minister Eric Williams used to say, you know, when I speak, let no damn dog bark. You know, so it's either you adopt that position or you want to adopt a consultative position, in which case you can't come out and make an announcement as to a deadline upfront if you haven't done the consultations. You can't have
So what do you think should happen next to Martin George? How do you think we can best resolve this?
Well, the thing is, I think that this, you know, graduated approach of the slow climb down is what the government is hoping would, by, I guess, the carrot and the stick, you know, the threat that, well, yes, are going to implement it, you know. I think they're hoping that that would, you know, I guess, encourage more persons to go out and voluntarily be vaccinated. And if that works, I'm happy, because at the end of the day, I am all for the vaccination and I want to get it done. And, you know, as, you know, from a personal perspective and also as a business chamber perspective, we have encouraged the government's policies in terms of the vaccination and, you know, trying to get it done. It's just that this particular one, especially premised on the big bold announcement that was made in mid-December, you know, it just doesn't appear to be well thought out in terms of, you know, actualizing and operationalizing it.
All right, Martin George, we do have to leave it there, but thank you for lending your expertise to the issue as usual.
It's always a pleasure, Natalie, and the very best to you and all at TTT. Thank you.
All right, same to you, Martin George. Martin George, you're president of the Tobago Business Chamber and, of course, Legal Mind, talking to us. And he says, egg on the government's face. Should have done the consultations before making such a big, bold announcement, and now having to kind of renege, kind of have to draw back on it. But I would say that probably the government can say that it's working, even if not worked, because, you know, they have seen an uptick in vaccinations, you know, since the announcement. So maybe it was a good strategy.
My takeaway there is the slow climb down.
Yeah.
Slow climb down.
Yeah. Well, you know what? To me, a government has a responsibility to listen to its people.
Correct.
There's absolutely no sense bringing legislation or putting policy into place that the people are telling you we don't want. So on whose behalf are you doing it?
Yes.
You're here to work for the people, and it may not be the best decision, what the people want. Because as a government, you do have a responsibility, and sometimes you do have to be autocratic too. You do have to take decisions and take matters into your own hands. And as they say, when you talk, no dog bark, but let's see how it will go.
But you know, we've been saying since the beginning of this pandemic, the government is in a very unfortunate position because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So either way, it was going to have backlash, whether they did consultations first or they did the mandatory vaccines first. Either way, some people was not going to be happy.
Yeah, so. But you know, the government knows it doesn't have the luxury of announcing then doing consultations, especially with the unions. Like, that should have never happened, because now you're going to hear all they keep saying is that Rowley's a bully, Rowley's is an autocratic leader, and this. if you had done the consultations and even if they didn't agree, you did what you needed to do.
And you would think that there would have been enough experience in the past and lessons learned that he would not
I was
take
about
that
to
approach.
say we didn't go through this with you the other day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you know, we had to figure it out. And I think it's just a matter of everybody just putting your heads in the game and saying we had to work together to be able to figure this out for the best way possible.